Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York. The reviews are in for Donald Trump's latest move, his latest vendetta case in the courts, and they are brutal. Even from notable MAGA corners and MAGA-friendly legal eagles, they are balking today at the criminal charges that have been levied against former director of the FBI, Jim Comey, over his beach shell art. And Republicans already deeply, deeply concerned about being wiped out in the midterms and saddled with a president whose approval ratings keep sinking lower and lower and lower, now have fresh fears that voter backlash over a president who seems completely disinterested in their economic concerns will continue to dig this hole he's in as Trump's efforts to prosecute his critics and stamp out free speech in America dominates the headlines coming from the Trump White House. Jonathan Turley, of all people, he's a Fox News fixture. He is a loyal, avid defender of Donald Trump. He actually testified for Donald Trump during the impeachment hearings in 2019. He's even defended Trump's decision to go to war with Iran without consulting Congress first. Now, today, he's saying this, quote, "I would prefer to crawl into one of Comey's conversant shells than write a column supporting him. However, here we are. The fact is that I believe that this indictment is facially unconstitutional, absent some unknown new facts." Turley goes on to say that it is unconstitutional because it tramples on a right we as Americans hold dear, the right to free speech. Jonathan Turley adding this, quote, "In forming this more perfect union, we created the world's greatest protection of free speech in history. It is arguably the most American contribution to our Bill of Rights. Great Britain did not and still does not protect free speech as we do. It comes as a cost. Perhaps Comey is that cost. However, he has a right to write out any hateful thoughts that come to him on his walks on the beach." For the record, Comey says he did not write out anything. He says he was on a walk and he came upon the shells on the beach, took a picture of them, and posted it on his Instagram. Either way, though, what's at stake here are big, huge matters, big, huge American matters of free expression and free speech. And you don't have to accept my word for it or anyone here at this network. You can take it from another MAGA fixture, another regular over on Fox News, Andrew McCarthy, who writes this in the conservative-leaning National Review, quote, "If it's possible, the Trump Justice Department's new indictment of former FBI Director Jim Comey is even more absurd than the previous indictment. That one failed to state a crime. This one fabricates a crime." It is a point echoed by Jim Comey's legal team earlier today. Comey appeared alongside the same attorneys who defended him in his first indictment, Pat Fitzgerald and Jessica Carmichael. He did not enter a plea, but his lawyers said that they would seek to dismiss the case on the basis of vindictive prosecution. It's a strategy that actually succeeded in getting the first Comey case dismissed. One of Comey's attorneys also asked the judge about preserving inflammatory statements made about Comey by the president and officials at the Justice Department. An all-out and politically unpopular assault on free speech in America, thinly disguised as a criminal case against Jim Comey that is only adding to the fissures in Trump's coalition, is where we start today. Former assistant special agent in charge at the FBI and national security and intelligence analyst for us, Michael Feinberg, is back. Also joining us, former deputy national security advisor to President Obama, now the co-host of Pod Save the World. Contributor Ben Rhodes is here. And former Department of Justice pardon attorney Liz Oyer is here as well. Liz, I start with you on today's court appearance. It strikes me, because I think here in year 9, year 10, whatever it is, it feels like year 77. What ways can we articulate both how autocratic and how wildly unpopular and how out of control Trump's Justice Department is acting? And to me, the indictment of Todd Blanche's conduct from Jonathan Turley and Mr. McCarthy is as good a place to sort of illustrate how out of the mainstream of MAGA legal minds they really are.
It's really shocking and chilling and frankly upsetting, Nicole. I mean, it's really, truly shaken a lot of people, including myself, to see how off the rails this Justice Department has come and how quickly under Todd Blanche's leadership, the idea that he has brought this indictment that every lawyer on the planet seems to agree is not based on any legal merit should really shock and disturb everyone in this country. Todd Blanche has demonstrated that his number one priority is to be able to do what Pam Bondi has not succeeded in doing, which is to prosecute Donald Trump's political enemies. And he has demonstrated that he will go to any length under the sun to accomplish that, even if it means blatantly ignoring the legal requirements. One thing that I noticed from his press conference yesterday announcing these charges and from his press conference announcing the charges against the Southern Poverty Law Center is that he is not afraid to mislead the public about what the grand jury process involves, about what the legal standards are for bringing a case and proving guilt. He just openly misstates the law and provides misinformation about how the justice system works in furtherance of his political objectives, which is a very scary thing to have coming from the top official over the Justice Department.
Liz, why do you think he does that? I mean, it's not like this moment won't end. Why do you think he lies so brazenly?
I think that he is totally focused on power. He is in a position of power. He wants to keep that power, and he is essentially drunk with power and making decisions that have no place in an official capacity like the one that he serves. I mean, this indictment, it really is a betrayal of the integrity of the justice system. He is misusing the justice system in a way that should really offend every single American. And the fact that he lies about it, the fact that he says things that are not true, shows that he has no regard for facts or law or evidence. All he cares about is getting a result for his boss, which is just totally improper from the acting U.S. attorney or acting attorney general for the United States.
Ben Rhodes, it is jarring. And just to pull back the curtain on our process here, we gut check ourselves 1,000 times when we present to our audience anything Megyn Kelly says about anything, or Tucker Carlson, or Joe Rogan, because they are not partners, right, in the effort to protect democracy. Double and triple that gut check when it's Jonathan Turley, who testified on behalf of Donald Trump, who has laundered some of Trump's policies over the last 10 years, who before Trump was also a Fox News fixture, and sort of stood at that fork in the road and then threw in all in with Donald Trump. His rebuke is sharper than just about anything I saw on this network or any mainstream outlet over the last 24 hours. What is your theory of the case for why Trump's closest allies in MAGA-adjacent media are condemning this indictment?
Well, Nicole, look, I'd like to believe that there's a substantive reason that people object to this kind of brazen authoritarian persecution of one's enemies. There's a cynical part of me, though, that is looking at the fact that Donald Trump is polling at, 33%, I think is the last number that I saw. I mean, just epically low polling numbers. And those numbers are only going in one direction. Donald Trump has kind of lost the plot, even on what MAGA cares about with his war in Iran. The midterm elections are coming. The next presidential election is around the corner. Donald Trump will not be on the ballot. And what I'm getting at here is that I think people on the right are beginning to look past Donald Trump. They're beginning to realize that, as you just said in your question, this isn't permanent. Todd Blanche, in the best scenario for Todd Blanche, he gets to be in that job for 2.5 more years, and then he has the rest of his life to deal with. So does Jonathan Turley. So does Tucker Carlson, And so I think what some of these people are doing is that they're beginning to realize that the sun is setting on Donald Trump. And therefore, his grip on the Republican Party and its associated media and external support organs, he's losing that grip. I think that's what's happening, Nicole, to be honest. I mean, yes, I think there's some sincere policy difference. Tucker Carlson clearly does not like the war in Iran. I'm not suggesting that there's not policy disagreement, but the willingness to be this outspoken, I think, is tied to the fact that people are beginning to look to the future in which Donald Trump is no longer at the center of politics or the center of attention or the center even of MAGA.
I mean, I think to be less sort of elegant about it, the case is absolute garbage. I mean, I think the other thing is, like, this is low-hanging fruit. If you're an actual lawyer, this seems like a good one to say, this is the bottom of the garbage on the bottom of the garbage can. I mean, Ben, it feels like the more unpopular Trump gets, the more desperate and in some ways shocking his conduct is, the more sort of out of the authoritarian closet he gets. But that has this ancillary effect of letting anyone trying to separate themselves from him smack him down before any political opponents can.
That's right. You're exactly right, Nicole. And they're looking for the easy ones where they can show, oh, I was willing to call this out, or I was willing to have a difference. Or, in the case of like Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan, they're looking at issues where they have an instinct that their own audience doesn't like what Trump's doing, that their own audience is unhappy about high gas prices. So they're responding to their audience. But your point about, look, if some people listen to this and say, well, this sounds great, like, the sun's setting on Trump, it's kind of scary, too, because I do think he's not someone who will accept irrelevance. He's someone who's probably acutely aware that the sand is running through the hourglass of his time as president, and he might get more extreme. He may very well get more extreme in his actions. And what that means is that whether it's, Jonathan Turley or any of these other people, they're going to at some point have to take harder stands because the issue is probably going to be pressed again and again. This isn't the last time Donald Trump's going to try to persecute his political opponents, right? Iran might not be the last war, but whatever the corruption that we see on a day-to-day basis will get more brazen, right, as they're trying to essentially loot the store before it has new ownership. And so actually, I think it's not going to be as easy as some people might think to just say, I'm going to take a freebie and, come out against this one thing. This is going to keep happening. And the question is going to keep getting called to all these people. And ultimately, it's going to get called to the Republicans in Congress and to the Supreme Court of the United States.
Let's turn to more breaking news just in from Washington. We just got a major decision from the Supreme Court on redistricting. Let's go to Lisa Rubin, MS Now senior legal reporter. Lisa, bring us up to speed.
Well, Anna, this decision is one of the most eagerly anticipated of this Supreme Court term. This is a decision coming out of Louisiana, which the court was deciding whether or not the creation of a second majority-minority voting district for its congressional races was constitutional or not, and whether or not it was in compliance with the Voting Rights Act. Here, the court is deciding by a 6-3 vote and a decision authored by Justice Alito that the map that Louisiana created in order to comply with the Voting Rights Act is not a map that can stand. The court's saying that the Voting Rights Act sometimes justifies racially based decision-making consistent with the Constitution, but here that while the state's efforts to comply were laudatory, this particular district is a racial gerrymander that cannot stand. That means that it will go back down to the lower courts for further decision-making about the composition of congressional maps in Louisiana. But this could have reverberations beyond Louisiana as well, Anna.
And I want to bring in Leah Lippman, who's standing by with us. Leah, give me your reaction to this ruling. Okay, we'll come back to Leah as soon as we have some of those audio and technical issues figured out. Lisa, as far as the implications go on this, the Voting Rights Act we know is important here, and the population in Louisiana is about a third Black. So will their voices and their votes be heard? I think that's the big question people are asking, given the map was drawn in response to a previous ruling that they needed to have more representation, this population.
Yes, and what the court is holding here, Anna, is that this was an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. So you have to ask, are the lines going to be drawn in a way that disperses the votes of African Americans in the state of Louisiana such that their voices will not be heard in the way that we have traditionally understood the Voting Rights Act to support? That's a legitimate question on the table now, how the state is going to redraw these maps in a way that both complies with the Voting Rights Act, but also comports with this court's decision today, an unambiguous decision where you have all 6 of the court's conservatives in the majority, and you have 3 of the court's liberals in dissent. I have yet to read the dissent. We've got 92 pages of decisions here, but this is one that we expected could have large reverberations across the country. And I just want to situate this in the context of some of these larger redistricting fights that are happening across the country. We are seeing a number of states try to redistrict for political reasons, to gain a political advantage. And while we see whether or not, for example, the Virginia maps are going to hold or whether Florida is going to redistrict, this adds a whole new variable into those House maps for the 2026 election. Are states going to now reconsider some of their maps in light of today's decision in ways that could even further throw the balance of power of the House of Representatives into disarray?
Lisa, stay with us. I want to bring in Barbara McQuade. She's former U.S. attorney, also an MS Now legal analyst. Barbara, what's your reaction to this decision?
Yeah, you know, on its face, it looks a little less than I think many people had feared, because there was some concern that the majority of the court would strike down the Voting Rights Act in its entirety. Justice Alito, writing for the majority, does say that voting rights based on race is a compelling governmental interest. And as long as maps meet strict scrutiny, then those are permissible. But then they turn around and say, but this one doesn't. And that racial minorities are entitled to electing the candidates of their choice. But that doesn't mean based on race. It just means they can choose the Republican or choose the Democrat. And because these voters can do that, then there is no need for this second district that was created to provide a majority black district. And so that might sound okay on a first blush, but I think the real disclosure of what's happening here comes in the dissent of Elena Kagan, who says that today's decision renders Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act all but a dead letter. She talks about how the Voting Rights Act was born of the literal blood of Union soldiers and civil rights marchers, and this betrays a faithful implementation of the Equal Protection Clause. So on its face, it looks sort of innocuous. She says even antiseptic. But in practice, I think this is going to mean that it's going to be impossible for minority voters to ever make out a claim under the Voting Rights Act Section 2.
Right. And as I mentioned, I want to bring in Leah Lippman for this. The current maps that are now being thrown out were drawn after courts had ruled that the previous map didn't adequately represent the population there and was in violation of the Voting Rights Act. So what is the Supreme Court suggesting is the proper remedy? Leah,
sorry,
can you hear me?
Is that for Leah? Is that for me or for Leah?
So it's for Leah.
What the Supreme Court is saying is that the Voting Rights Act actually did not require the state of Louisiana to draw an additional majority-minority district. So instead of striking down what remains of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, and its protections for multiracial democracy and districting, the Supreme Court has adopted an exceptionally narrow and cramped reading of Section 2, one that will essentially almost never require states to draw additional majority-minority districts. What the court effectively said is, so long as the plaintiffs who are challenging these maps that states draw can't identify an alternative map that would both provide an additional majority-minority district and retain the same partisan composition as the state's initial map, then the state often isn't going to be required to draw that second district. The reality, however, is that there is racial polarization in voting. So race and party are inextricably linked. And what that means is it's almost never going to be possible for plaintiffs to show that a state can draw an additional majority-minority district, but that additional majority-minority district will still vote Republican in the way that the previous district would have. That's why Justice Kagan in dissent is writing for the Democratic appointees and calls this ruling one that renders what remains of the Voting Rights Act a nullity. She situates this latest ruling in a trilogy of cases that the Supreme Court has issued dismantling the Voting Rights Act. She says, look, back in 2013 in Shelby County versus Holder, the court effectively nullified what was the preclearance regime, which required certain states with especially egregious histories of voting discrimination to get the federal government's permission before changing their voting laws or policies. Then, in a later decision, Brnovich versus DNC, the Supreme Court effectively made it almost impossible to challenge what are called voting preconditions, rules that affect who can vote, like a voter identification requirement. And since that decision in Brnovich, there have been zero successful Section 2 challenges to voting conditions. The decision today in Louisiana versus Calais completes the set, because it effectively dismantles the last leg in the Voting Rights Act's protections, which was for redistricting. Whereas previously, the Voting Rights Act had said when a state draws districts in ways that have the effect of diluting the voting power of racial minorities, of effectively making it so racial minorities' votes count for less than white voters, and that they can never elect the candidates of their choice. Now, the Supreme Court has said, go ahead, state legislatures, draw districts, maybe even redraw districts in ways that lock voters of color out of power. That is to undo the Voting Rights Act and what it did for this country, namely make it into a multiracial democracy.
Lisa, what happens now with the midterms? Does Louisiana have to create new maps?
It does. Anna, the very end of the decision says that this is going to be remanded to the district court. And by that, I take it to be a 3-judge panel in the Western District of Louisiana for further proceedings, which means that Louisiana's maps will be withdrawn. Unless Leah understands that differently, that's my understanding of today's decision. The other question, though, of course, is whether or not other states will also use today's decision as a basis to further redraw maps in their own states. It used to be that mid-decade redistricting was an anomaly, something that we never saw unless called for by a court's decision. But of course, we are now seeing across the country all sorts of reasons for redistricting. And this Calais decision may be a pretext for other states to say, oh, wait a second, we have too many majority-minority districts that wouldn't pass muster under the new configured test for Section 2. Given how stringently the court is drawing that test, maybe we, too, need to configure our own districts before they're challenged in court. So I do think Louisiana's maps will be withdrawn at a minimum, and we may see some other states try to do the same in theoretical compliance with today's decision, Anna.
Pete Hegseth testifying before the House Armed Services Committee amid a deeply unpopular war that is grinding toward a second month. And the mood was contentious, even before the questioning started. Protesters confronted Hegseth on his way into the hearing.
You should be disgusted with yourself.
You need to be arrested.
Not to be outdone, Hegseth then used his opening statement to attack the war's critics, calling them the, quote, biggest challenge. Take a listen.
The biggest challenge, the biggest adversary we face at this point are the reckless, feckless, and defeatist words of congressional Democrats and some Republicans.
In return, those reckless, feckless Democrats accused Hegseth of breathtaking hypocrisy, namely accusing his critics of being reckless and feckless while leading a war that has proceeded in the absence of congressional approval and any clear endpoint. Take a listen.
You have been lying to the American public about this war from day one, and so has the president. The strategy has been an outstanding example of incompetence. This war of choice is a political and economic disaster at every level.
You were incompetent then. You're incompetent now.
Do you believe that the president is mentally stable enough to be the commander-in-chief?
Did you ask the same question of Joe Biden for 4 years?
Joe Biden is not the president.
You need to resign immediately.
It's the incompetence.
Hegseth testified that the cost of the Iran war has hit $25 billion so far. That is an enormous figure, but according to Politico, it, quote, falls far behind many outside estimates. Hegseth dodged other critical questions on the Hill today. He refused to give an estimate on the timeline for withdrawal from Iran. He refused to say whether he is, quote, beholden to the president or whether he's beholden to the Constitution. He also refused to say whether he had advised the president to go to war. And then there was this. He got tripped up on a key point. Take a listen.
Their nuclear facilities have been obliterated. Underground, they're buried, and we're watching them 24/7. So we know where any nuclear material
reclaiming
might be.
my time for
we're
just
watching
a quick
it.
second here. We had to start this war, you just said, 60 days ago, because the nuclear weapon was an imminent threat. Now you're saying that it was completely obliterated?
They had not given up their nuclear ambitions, and they had a conventional shield of thousands
so
of missiles.
Operation Midnight Hammer accomplished
moment.
nothing of substance. It left us at exactly the same
point.
place we were before.
Joining me now to kick things off tonight is the admirable Admiral John Kirby, the former White House National Security Communications Advisor. He is also an MS Now National Security Analyst. Admiral, even some of the Republicans say that the Trump administration has failed to provide a compelling rationale for this war or to articulate what the end game is here. Do you think that Secretary Hegseth provided any clarity today with this jaunt on the Hill?
I think there were some missed opportunities for the secretary today. I think this would have been a terrific chance for him to lay out what the strategic objectives are and how they're going after each and every one of them. And I didn't see anything in the hearing today, and I watched a lot of it that convinced me that they were actually trying to answer that question. It was a missed opportunity for sure to lay out to the American people finally. I mean, it's been 60 days before the secretary testified finally to lay out why we're doing this and why now.
Well, there have been a lot of questions about the strike on the Iranian girls' school. This happened in the early days of the war. And today, Democratic Congressman Adam Smith brought it up. Let's take a listen to that exchange between the congressman and the secretary.
The girls' school that got hit in the first days of this war. There is absolutely no question at this point what happened. We made a mistake, and that happens in war. We identified this target based on earlier charts, and yet 2 months after it happened, we refused to say anything about it, giving the world the impression that we just don't care. We do not care about the casualties and the chaos that is caused by our war, and we should care.
What do you make of the fact that military leadership has refused to take ownership of what many are regarding as a colossal mistake?
I think it's important for the United States military to complete this investigation as quickly as possible. I'm frankly a little surprised that it's taken this long, although I know there's a lot of interagency coordination that has to go into laying out the findings conclusively. But I think it's important to wrap this up quickly and to be completely transparent with the American people about what happened, why it happened, and more critically, how we're going to prevent it from happening in the future. I know that the U.S. Central Command did a thorough job here. I've talked to some officials there. I think there's a process problem here that it has taken too long to work its way through, but it's imperative. And Representative Smith is not wrong. I mean, we should come clean on this so that we can, more importantly, learn from it and prevent it from happening again.
What does it mean, though, that we won't acknowledge that perhaps a mistake was made here? Even in the absence of a conclusive investigation, something obviously went wrong.
I want to believe, Melissa, that what's slowing this down is the interagency coordination process, because the preliminary findings, at least as reported in the press, made it seem like it was the intelligence was perhaps old that was applied to the targeting solution, and the intelligence that was provided to the military came from outside the military. So I want to believe that what's slowing this down is the coordination process with the intelligence community, and they'll wrap this up quickly. That's the generous view. I think the cynic's view would be that this administration doesn't like to admit mistakes, doesn't like to apologize, doesn't like to show what they consider weakness, but it's not weakness. If you've made a mistake, if you've hit something in error, then admit it as soon as you possibly can and tell the public what you're going to do to try to prevent it from happening again. That's not weakness. That's strength. That's confidence. That's security in your process and in your military capabilities. And that's not what's being transmitted to the American people right now. Again, I want to believe this is a process problem and not a policy problem. But the cynics, I understand, are out there thinking that this is more of a policy issue.
Well, the cynics are not just focused on that particular issue. They also have raised concerns over Hegseth's personnel decisions. Take a listen to Congressman Don Bacon.
I share a bipartisan concern of the firings that we've seen at the Pentagon. 4 of the 6 service chiefs, for example, the Coast Guard. We had a huge bipartisan majority here that had confidence in the Army Chief of Staff and the Secretary of Navy. And I would just point out, it may be constitutionally right. You have the constitutional right to do these things, but it doesn't make it right or wise.
So there have been a lot of discussion of these personnel firings within the military, and some news outlets, including the New York Times, have noted that women and minorities appear to bear the brunt of these firings. Yeah. What do you make of this shift in the personnel, and what does it mean for the fighting force that is incredibly diverse, as our armed forces are, to have a leadership structure that may be less diverse in terms of race and gender than it has been in the past?
It's hard to know to know exactly how to answer that question because they haven't been transparent about why these individuals are being fired.
Meanwhile, Republican Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky has written an op-ed in the Washington Post asking, why is the Pentagon holding up Ukraine funds? In it, he writes in part, quote, headlines often say that Americans don't support U.S. aid to Ukraine, but real Americans say otherwise. They have consistently affirmed that Washington should aid Kyiv in resisting Russian aggression. Congress last year acted on that wish. Republican majorities on both armed services committees authorized $400 million for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative for each of the next 2 years. Yet the Ukraine aid we passed months ago is now collecting dust at the Pentagon. When Senate appropriators have sought an explanation from the department's policy shop, led by Undersecretary Elbridge Colby, they've been stonewalled. If we're serious about drone dominance, we shouldn't sandbag a relationship with the world's foremost drone experts. And if we're keen on remaining the world's preeminent superpower, we shouldn't let unelected defense officials undermine U.S. leadership and obstruct deepening ties with Ukraine's innovative military and industrial base. What gives?
There's so much to go through right here. David French, you talk about in your latest Times piece about meeting the leader of the free world. Let's just look at this is a moment. There's sometimes in history you actually see a moment. And see things starting to change and see remarkable things happening. This past week, you have Ukraine getting 100 billion euros from the EU. And Zelensky basically saying to the United States, you don't want to help us, Donald Trump? We don't need your help. We don't need your help. You have our allies in the Gulf. What are they doing? They're begging the Ukrainians to come, to help them out, to defend their people in the war that America started. You have David Petraeus yesterday saying, do you want to see the future of warfare? Do you want to see the type of warfare that makes older weapon systems obsolete? David Petraeus says, all you have to do, look no further than Ukraine. They are doing it. And I must say also, and it is such a tragedy that Vladimir Putin is sending so many young Russian men and not so young now Russian men to their deaths. But you look at the death counts, they're just absolutely staggering on Russia's side. And David, I want you to talk about this, but I have to underline this again. I've been lied to by members of the Trump administration for a year now, telling me how weak Ukraine is, how they're about to lose the Donbass, how they need to surrender, how they need to go to the negotiating tables with their head between their, how they're holding no cards. No, history is now showing us the way it is the way it's sort of revealing itself with all these dominoes falling, that it is actually Ukraine that seems to be holding all the cards now. That's why the Saudis, that's why the Emiratis, that's why everybody in the Middle East is begging them to come and help them, because they are the future when it comes to fighting warfare.
Yeah, we're watching something really remarkable happen, because if you go back a year ago, Trump very famously says to Ukraine, you don't have any cards. That's in the middle of a major Russian offensive. Russia was inching across the Donbass. There was a lot of pessimism about Ukraine's future. And look what's happened in a year. In a year, you've had Ukraine stopping this Russian offensive well short of its goals. You've had Ukraine recapturing some key ground. You've had Ukraine gaining in confidence on the battlefield, even as American aid diminishes, to such an extent that we saw something really remarkable in the Persian Gulf, which is Ukraine fighting for its life is powerful enough to extend aid to the Gulf states who were unprepared for the drone threat, and even to start to talk about extending assistance to the U.S., which was unprepared, not fully prepared for the drone threat. So what you've got is Zelensky is quite obviously gaining more confidence right now, because I think it has clicked in his mind that he's the commander of arguably the most potent ground force in the world right now. This drone revolutionized Ukrainian army is unlike anything that we've seen. It is the pioneer in modern warfare. And in many ways, we're behind. We still have a much more powerful military overall because of our Navy, because of our Air Force, our overwhelming air power that Ukraine doesn't have. But this is a very powerful country led by a man who is exerting increasing leadership on the global stage, who is helping Europe regain its own backbone and sense of self-confidence. In a lot of ways, if you want to see the heart of the defense of liberty in the world, you're going to find it more in Kyiv than almost any other capital in the Western world right now. And that is not a development that even a year ago people would have expected.
Vladimir Putin expected to take Kyiv in 3 days. Here we are all these years later. And in Kyiv, you have leaders that escaped that first night where Zelensky delivered that extraordinary message that our children and grandchildren will be hearing about and reading about in history books, watching in history books. That extraordinary message saying we are here, we are alive, we are fighting back. And now we're in a position where we're watching the Ukrainians, Willie, in the most extraordinary way, out of necessity, out of the defense of their homeland, out of the defense of their children who are being kidnapped, out of the defense of their grandmothers who are being targeted by Putin for murder. They have created weapon systems now that actually are the envy of the world, that make older weapon systems obsolete. It is an extraordinary thing to behold.
Yeah, there's something incredible happening, which is that in the midst of its war, Ukraine is providing the United States and other nations with technology, defense technology, these drones where they've become the world leader. So it's kind of a stunning move to have, David, the president of Ukraine in the middle of a fight for his country's life saying, you know what, Donald Trump, United States, you don't want to help me the way I think we need to be helped. Okay, I guess we have to accept that, but I'm willing to help you. You should use these drones in your war with Iran.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing that's so stunning about the last several months is this the reversal of fortune on the battlefield is largely driven by Ukrainian weapons produced in Ukraine with tactics developed in Ukraine, technologies developed in Ukraine. It's not as if they've counterattacked with a phalanx of American-made tanks and weapons. No, they have counterattacked with a phalanx of Ukrainian-made weapons. Now, that's not to say that they don't rely an awful lot still on Western weapons. They absolutely do. But if you're talking about the core innovations on the battlefield, they're Ukrainian. And you can see Ukrainian confidence growing right now because they have cracked a code on the battlefield that the Russians have not been able to answer. They've cracked a code that in many ways even America and our allies haven't been able to answer in the Persian Gulf. That's why they're so valuable in providing assistance now. This is a remarkable turn of events. As Joe said, go back to 2022, the expectation was 72 hours, 96 hours in Kyiv Falls. And here we are, years later, with a new world power named Ukraine that is a leader of the free world. This is not something that people anticipated.
And the Russians can't keep up with the technology because they're the best and brightest fled. They fled because of a stupid war, because of a stupid invasion they wanted no part of. And in the United States, you just wonder how much the slashing of research and development that this Trump administration has focused on. The smartest and brightest minds being kicked out of America, the smartest and brightest and most advanced departments in our best universities in America, which are some of the best universities on the planet, they're being warfare in the Trump administration against them and against the research. It's just pure insanity. Caddy, let's add a dimension to this as we continue talking about Ukraine. Let's add the dimension of a Netanyahu. Netanyahu now joins the league after reading what he is doing, after reading what Zelensky has caught him doing. He joins Orban, Trump, Le Pen, all of these other anti-democratic, autocratic wannabes in supporting Vladimir Putin. And the madness of it all is that he's supporting Putin, who is supporting Iran. It's just like Netanyahu, in the weeks leading up to October 7th, was demanding that Qatar give Hamas hundreds of millions of dollars to continue propping up that terrorist organization. And so yesterday, you had Netanyahu being caught red-handed, helping the Russian invaders. You had a former Mossad chief who was touring the West Bank saying, my mother was a victim of the Holocaust. What's happening to Palestinians reminds me a lot of what has happened to Jews in the past. It was an absolutely stunning situation. And all this is on Netanyahu. And 60% of Americans now, 60%, I never thought I'd see this in my lifetime. 60% of Americans are opposed to Israel. This is all on Benjamin Netanyahu's back, and things just keep getting worse as they continue Netanyahu's endless war so he stays out of jail.
Yeah, Haaretz is reporting, the Israeli paper is reporting, it's not just one shipment, but since 2023, there have been 30 shipments, according to their reporting, of this grain that comes from Ukrainian land that the Russians have taken, and now they're selling it. And as you say, I mean, the absurdity of this, that the Israelis are paying money to the Russians so the Russians can buy drones from the Iranians, thereby funding the Iranian war machine, which Israel is now fighting. I mean, it makes no logical sense, but it doesn't. I saw that the former Mossad chief in the West Bank, and it was stunning what he was saying. Kind of language he would use for what Israel is doing at the moment in the West Bank under Benjamin Netanyahu. None of this is going to help Benjamin Netanyahu's standings, which have cratered in the U.S. I've rarely seen polls move so swiftly against a country, and it's not just amongst Democrats. This is amongst Republicans as well, and particularly amongst younger Americans who, in about a generation, will be the ones in power, and Israelis must know that. If I was sitting in Israel right now, I would be very worried about the long-term prospects for continued support, financial and military support, from the United States.